to rain, but still following a very sort of similar pattern in terms of other reasons why someone would fast. Let's take a look. Seder Taniyot Elu, this order of fasting, Ha'omer B'Reviyah Rishonah, are things said about the first rain, and if the first rain is delayed. Aval tzmachim sheshanu, if sprouts have changed, there's some actually blight or other type of a thing that they are that the way they're growing is different than they should be growing. Then that's like an immediate problem. Maybe there's an infestation. That's not something that you can delay and go through a whole series of 3, 7, first Yechidim, then Tzibur. That's something that there's something immediate that needs to be dealt with. What? I said changed.
It sounds like it changed from like a week to a bar.
No. Anyway, we're not dealing with miraculous things. Although we are praying to God, but still b'derech hateva. Matru'in aleihem miyad. Those types of things you matru'in, you blast for, call out for immediately. If you'll remember, there's a debate whether that means shofar blasts, or does it mean anenu, or does it mean both of them. But you do, presumably, the whole special series of tefillot, accompanied with that was, assumed to be packaged with that, was together the 24 brachot of Shemona Esrei, maybe the taking of the Aron out into the courtyard. So all of the special prayers, you respond immediately. Now, what about fasting? So let's take a look. We'll see about the issue about fasting in a minute. This says matru'in aleihem miyad. If there's a 40 days, even if it did rain in the right time, or roughly in the right time, but then there's a 40-day period where there was no rain, that also could be terrible, because then the plants start growing and then there's no rain, and maybe, then it's perhaps even more urgent. So in that case, matru'in aleihem, you also begin to do the special tefillot, because that is a plague, a smiting of bitzoret, of famine, although bitzoret is a little bit less severe, as we'll see in the Gemara, than ra'av. I don't know, how do they translate bitzoret there? Famine? Drought. Okay. So Rav and Bitzoret, both, although Rav I guess normally translated as famine, both have to do with
affliction of food shortage.
Affliction of food shortage. Okay. Anyway, both of those have to do with the lack of rain and therefore the lack of crops, but Bitzoret is less severe than Ra'av. Okay, now by the way, if you think about it, the 3, and the 7, how much time was that? 3 was about a week and a half, another 3 is about another week and a half, that's 3 weeks, 7 is four and a half weeks.
If you start the second series.
5, whatever, so we'll round up. Anyway, 7 is like 4.5 weeks, right? So that's like about 8 weeks. You round up a little bit because 9 weeks. So that's about, what is that? About 60 days. So anyway, but the starting of, so that's till the end of that series, but the starting of the 7, right, will come, remember there were 3 periods. There was the 3 weeks of Yechidim, then the 3 weeks of the tzibur with in the starting in the daytime, 3 weeks of the tzibur starting at the nighttime, and then the 7 where you did the matru'in and the special tefillot. So 3 and 3 is 9, which is about 4.5 weeks, call it 5 weeks, 35 days. My point being that there you got to the matru'in and the most severe after around 35 days. Here, ben geshem legeshem arba'im yom, it's the same period of time without rain. Right? It's not like here, because it started raining, it's a shorter period of time has passed, and it makes it worse. But nevertheless, even though it's already rained, once there's that long of a gap, that makes it very severe and very urgent. Yes?
If they do the 3, and 7, they will be fasting on Hanukkah.
Okay, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. What I also have to say is not clear to me is when it says Avru Elu V'lo Nanu, or Avru Elu V'lo Yardu Geshamim, right, and this isn't discussed anywhere in the Gemara as far as I know. Does that mean immediately? Like we did our, Monday, Thursday, Monday, and we said, okay, no rain. Next Monday, Thursday, Monday, we're doing it again, that's what it sounds like. That's what it sounds like, You say, well, let's give it a little time, see if our tefillah works. It sounds like it's immediate. Anyway, it's interesting. I hadn't figured out that it will always run into Hanukkah, if that's really true. Okay, anyway, have to check the calendar on that.
Yeah, I
okay,
did.
all right, that's a good catch then. Okay, now, yardu litzmachim avalo yardu li'ilad. Let's say rain came down, enough rain for sprouts, meaning for crops, but not enough for the trees, or not appropriate for the trees. Li'ilad v'lo litzmachim, or for the trees, but it wasn't appropriate for the crops. Lazel was appropriate for both, avalo l'barot l'shichinu me'arot, but not enough for the wells and the cisterns. In those cases, matru'in aleihem miyad, you would but you would do the shofar blasts immediately. Now, that's a little bit interesting because we understand why. The point being that it's not enough that it works for one. There's a concern for the other. But what's the miyad? Like, even if everything is raining normally, it just wasn't enough for the trees. It wasn't right for the trees. That would be a miyad. Or is this maybe in the context of being geshem legeshem or ba'im yom? So maybe if in the context of 40 days makes sense. But anyway, this sounds pretty interesting. Not only is it enough to do a matri'in when it's when it's not good for one, even though it's good for the other, but there sounds to be a miyad element here, which is hard to understand. There is a miyad element here, which is hard to understand. Or if there's a city that didn't have rain, even though another city did, right? We had that. We did that drasha before. It could rain good for one city, not for another, for a portion of a city. So you might think, that if it's good, if the surrounding cities have the rain they need, it's not such a big deal. You'll just buy stuff from the surrounding cities. The Mishnah goes on and says, nevertheless, top of Yotet Amar Aleph, Otah ir mit'aneh umatra'at, that city fasts and does the blasts, v'kol savivoteha, and all around it, mit'anot v'lo matriot. Do the fasts without the blasts. I didn't mean for it to rain, but okay. Anyway, do the fast without the special tifilot. Okay, Rabbi Akiva Omer matriot v'lo mitanot. No, they only do the special tifilot, the surrounding cities, but they don't do the fasting. So there's a question of the implication for the surrounding cities, but we should just take a pause here to note that in the Tanakama, and this makes complete sense to be assumed that was the position at the beginning of the Mishnah, right? The first response is fasting. Only later, more intensified responses. Not only are we fasting, we're also doing this very radical sort of new tefillah service, right? Matriot was at the end of the process, at the 7. So presumably the whole point in the beginning of the Mishnah of matriot miyad, matri'in alehem miyad, had 2 chidushim. Or maybe it was the whole, or maybe you could call it one point, but it was A, the response is immediate, okay, and B, the response is not just, is the most extreme response, meaning the tefillah. But obviously, if you're doing the new tefillot, that includes everything that comes before the tefillot, comes the fast. So presumably, and now we've been talking about here, you start at the end. You start with the full package, with the fasts and with the tefillot. Now we're getting to an interesting position of Rabbi Akiva, who imagines that you can have and therefore, in some circumstances, you're only going to do the half package. You're only going to do the Taanit without the tefillot, the surrounding cities. But you do get a very interesting position of Rabbi Akiva, who says that you can have the tefillot without the Taaniyot. Now, again, presumably he is not saying that in the beginning of the Mishnah. Presumably in the beginning of the Mishnah, everybody agrees that the point is the full package. If you have a tragedy that's impending, then obviously you do the full package. Why would you do half of it? So that's the beginning of the Mishnah. But here at the end, you do have an interesting position of Rabbi Akiva that says you just do the tefillot and not the Taaniyot for the surrounding cities. Not so clear what this is about. Why would the surrounding cities do it at all? So if you look at, it could just be an issue of a type of imo anochi bitzara of then, but then why would it be limited to the surrounding cities? So if you look at the Rashi here, the Suda Rashi, he says matriot. Rashi says hachi garsina. We'll do the top line. Ota ir mitanel matraat ukosu yoseha mitanot. V'lo matriot, ulfikach mitanot she'oto ha'ir shelo yadu ala geshamim telech liknot tetfuah ba'oto ha'ir v'yeh ba'ra'av. That it's something that impacts you could have said that city should be very happy because then they'll get to have raise their prices or something. But okay, we won't be so callous. So there is here, it impacts the region. If a certain area has a real famine, even if everybody else is doing good, it means that there's going to be scarcity for everyone, or it's going to have some larger impact on the region. And therefore, the other surrounding cities participate in it. So with that in mind, what would be the idea of the matriot v'lo mitanot is interesting for Rabbi Akiva. Because again, as we've been saying, matriot is usually the higher level. But one could imagine, and if there's a possibility that, hey, maybe if we had to choose between the two, our tefillot are more impactful than our ta'anit, then why didn't we have the reverse order earlier, right? What is the idea of having here the tefillah without the ta'anit? So what I would suggest in Rabbi Akiva is that the ta'anit is a reflection of the suffering or an intensification of the suffering that you are already enduring. or that you are, and that, and you are saying, God, you have not given us rain. We are so suffering as a result, and the Taanit just really brings to the fore the intensity of the suffering. Look how physically suffering we are. We're expressing it right now to the fact we're not even eating, food the whole day, and we're fasting and we're miserable and so on. So it's an intensification and a greater expression of the actual suffering you're already undergoing. Whereas the surrounding cities aren't undergoing any suffering. Ta'anit would be an inappropriate expression for them. They could have tefillah, right, which is a way of praying for something that they're concerned about, right? They're concerned about the future. They're concerned about how this might come to impact them. But since it's so far, not about them, it's about someone else, right? So maybe the ta'anit is not the proper expression. So that's just speculation here. But Rabbi Akiva's position is interesting because until now, the tefillah always was, this extreme tefillah was always stage 2, right? And that's consistent, certainly the implication of the beginning of the Mishnah, the position of the Chachamim. So why would a surrounding city do tefillah without ta'anit? So I do think it does have something to do with the fact, according to Rabbi Akiva, that it is not personal about them. Okay, let's take a look now as it continues. V'chein ir sheyesh ba dever or mapolet. If a city has pestilence or mapolet, or some type of an issue with falling or walls, falling structures. Ota ir mit'aneh u'matraat. That city does the whole package. And the surrounding cities do the ta'anit, but not to the point of these greater tefillot. And Rabbi Akiva again says the interesting reverse position. Omer matriot, no, they do the more extreme tefillot, v'lo mitanot, but they do not do ta'anit. Now, again, not exactly clear, but one can speculate what the relevance is. Like, just because the walls of one city are falling down and they've got, how does that, they haven't been good at their upkeep, what does that affect us? But, if there's a medical emergency there and a lot of people are dying and injured or whatever, that could have an impact on the surrounding regions as well. The need for doctors and, and the other types of sort of ways in which those demands will make demands on the surrounding cities. But again, not 100% clear which are the ones that impact the surrounding cities, which are the ones that are identified, and which are the ones that are not. Yes.
Wouldn't collapsing buildings be most likely from an earthquake?
Well, that's interesting.
So when would you start? One pothole, 2 potholes,
Right.
3 potholes?
It's an interesting question.
And earthquakes are often followed by successive earthquakes.
Oh, that's interesting. Maybe.
And Eretz Israel has been plagued by earthquakes for millennia.
Interesting. Although one does wonder, because the Mishnayot and Brachot have a way of referring to earthquakes, right, when they deal with the brachot that you make. But that's interesting. Okay, that's a nice explanation. All right. Now, moving on. Ezu dever. Here, what would be an example of pestilence? How would you measure? Like, it's just not like, few people have died. What makes you think that there's actually a plague of pestilence going on here? By the way, what is that dever? That's like some type of, is it like, when they say it was, is it, do we know what the ancients meant when how we would medically categorize what dever is scientifically? What pestilence was? What was the Black Plague?
It's a bacterial infection transmitted by fleas.
So it's probably what these dever.
And there was the first really horrific example of it was actually in the 6th century CE, about the time the Talmud would have been completed.
Well, this is the Mishnah, though. All right. Anyway, presumably it is something. Anyway, whatever it is, plague. What would be a way of measuring it? Ira motzia chamesh miot ragli, a city that, it's an interesting phrase, that comes out from it 500 foot soldiers. What is that? Not exactly clear what that means. What does that mean? It has a population of 500 people or 500 men. V'yatzu mimenu, again, hamotzia, and then v'yatzu mimena, gimel meitim b'gimel yamim. So instead of the foot soldiers, people in their sort of strength and virility, coming out of the city, instead you have 3 dead people came out of the city. So anyway, it's a city of a certain population. I think, again, the imagery is ragli as opposed to meitim. But anyway, a city of a certain size population, and there are 3 deaths, b'gimel yamim zachar zen, 3 successive days. So harei zeh dever. That would be considered pestilence. At such a high percentage is dying. Pachot mikan, less than this, ein zeh dever. It is not considered. It's not considered to be pestilence. Presumably, also if it was 3 day after day, but the city was larger, it also wouldn't be pestilence because then it would be a lesser percentage of the city. So some way of measuring that there's a lot of deaths. Now again, does that mean there's also signs that they see, that they identify with dever, certain fake signs on the body, fevers or whatever? And the question is, together with that signs, what makes it rather than just a couple of freak deaths? It's like, what isn't that we have that whole thing? What is that? The Center for CDC, right? How do you start? When do you start translating a couple of unexplained deaths?
They pay the majority of my salary.
Right. Anyway, there you go. A couple of unexplained deaths into describing it as that we've actually got some communicable disease here. We've got some user thing going on, and that seems to be the issue. Presumably, there are other indications that this wasn't a guy that was 90 years old that died in his bed. That there was some something unusual about these deaths. Yes, Charlie.
I think this is the first example of the use of an incidence rate in the history of the disease.
Oh, interesting.
Mortality rate.
Very interesting. Okay. All right. Very good. Okay. Now, so those are the things that you start immediately. So there's 2 chidushim we've been introduced to. Number one is there's some things you start immediately. You have no patience for. It's not like the rain that'll come a little bit later. No, this thing is happening right away. We start at the end of the package immediately. Then there are others in which it points that the chiddush is that it applies to it's immediately affecting the local region, but the surrounding cities or villages really is an ear. The surrounding villages also participate in a lesser degree. And the question is the lesser degree Taanit without tefillah or tefillah without Taanit. But that's this category too. Now it continues. So within this context of the surrounding areas, the following are things that are not just the surrounding areas, but if they occur in one place, everywhere, like throughout the whole world, presumably, everybody has to participate in the matriin, and again, presumably matriin means the whole package. Ta'anit with the tefillah. What are they? Al hashidafon, the al hayerakon. So shidafon is some type of a blight of the crops. Yerakon is jaundice. The al ha'arbeh, at least that's what Rashi says here, right? Presumably not about the crops. Although it's funny that there would be that shift because the other things here are going to be very crop related. What does that say for Yerakon? Does it say jaundice or does it say a disease of the crops? Yellowing, but of the crops, right? I assume it says. Yeah, so it's still
wither and yellow.
Okay, so we're still within the crops. Okay, so hashidafon. So either right, blight or disease of the crops, val arbev, val chasil, different types of locusts, val chayara. So that's all about crops, and then
chasil is
caterpillars. Interesting. So that's all crop related, and then we shift to things that apply that are about humans and health and safety, as we did before. We were dealing with issues like dever, wild animals, evil animals. It's interesting to see how much any of these things parallel the 10 makot in Mitzrayim. You have dever, you have the smiting of the crops, you have the chayara. Anyway, the chayara val hacherev. And about troops, army troops that are going and conquering cities and marching through and wreaking violence. Matru'in Allah, and all those things. Everybody engages in the matru'in again, which presumably means the whole package. Ta'anit with the tefillot. Mipnei shimaka mahalechet, because it is a plague. It is that spreads. That's moving. It doesn't stay in one place, right? If there's locusts, they'll wipe out one place and then they'll move to the next. If there's these types of disease of the crops, the disease spreads. The army troop spreads. Now, an interesting question is, number one, if there was anything that I would think would have been mahalechet, I would have said it would have been the dever of the previous category. So maybe they didn't exactly know how contagious that was. Maybe we don't exactly understand what they meant by dever, because obviously they understood the idea of contagion because they're dealing with things like yerakon, and they see that those are issues that spread. Anyway, these types of things are things that apply to everybody. That this thing could be coming to you next.
So even though troops are going through just the northern part.
Yes. Now let's take a look. The Mishnah elaborates. Now again, the question is there some point where you say no, that's never happening here, right? But maybe not. Like maybe it doesn't go from one continent to the next. But let's take a look at what the Mishnah says. Okay, Maaseh, where were we? That the elders came from Jerusalem back to their villages. The Gazu Taanit al Shenira Kamali Pi Tanur Shitafon Ba'ashkelon, and they made a Taanit because there was the fill of a oven. We'll see what that means of Shitafon, of this type of a disease of the or a destruction of the grain in Ashkelon. So it's not exactly clear. Did they come from Ashkelon to Yerushalayim, or it sounds like they were in Yerushalayim. They heard about what happened in Ashkelon. Then when they went back to their villages, they made the Ta'anit in their villages as well because of this blasting of the grain in Ashkelon. So that's a pretty okay, but that's still all within all within Israel. It's not so distant. But okay, so what are the limits of B'chol Makom? So let's keep on going. The Od Gazu Ta'anit al Sha'achlu Ze'evim Shnei Tinokot Be'ever HaYarden, because wolves had eaten two babies or two children in Ever HaYarden. So there were these wild animals that were attacking people in the settled areas. Rabbi Yossi Omer Lo Sha'achlu al Shaniru. Not only even if they didn't attack yet, but the fact that they were walking around in the settled areas, in the villages and the cities, and they're supposed to be only in the forests. So that itself is enough of a threat. Now again, that's Ever HaYarden. How far Ever HaYarden? Ever HaYarden is not Chutz Laaretz, meaning even if they're not talking halachically Ever HaYarden, Ever HaYarden still means in immediate proximity to Israel. It doesn't mean way over in Bavel. So what exactly is the limits of B'chol Makom is not clear. At a certain point, you could ask it in two ways. Number one is, to what degree do you just feel a connectedness to, do you sort of see yourself as belonging to that country or to those people? That's like completely, even if in practice the thing might spread, but it's not yet shaykh to me, sort of the way you think. To what degree is this your country, your region? And the other question is the practical question. At a certain point you'll say, it's never possible that it's going to spread that far, right? Something going on in Australia, right? So right now that we have all this massive communication, we'll be fasting every single day because somewhere in the globe one of these things is happening. So I think it's a two question. It's a way of perception of connectedness and the reality of the concern of it spreading. What are the limits of B'chol Makom is not spelled out in this Mishnah.
It's amazing given the communication, though. In other words, how they have a consciousness to get news out.
Right.
Any of the things we assume today for communication.
Right, that news would spread.
It's
yeah.
extraordinary.
Yeah. So I do think this raises, a very important question, because look, we're also getting into this issue of, about that sense of responsibility towards the rest of the community, even a very distantly spread community. So to some degree, and it gets also to this question about why were the surrounding villages praying? The Rashi says they were praying because it might affect them as well. But maybe they're praying because they just have a responsibility. They have a connectedness, and they want to participate in the concern for this one village among them, even if it won't affect them, right? So I think that there is a question here about that sense of responsibility, although here we really do seem to be talking about impact. If it's happening there, it's going to happen to me. But still, it's a question of how do you perceive what your sort of, what your connectedness is, like, who are not just the people you're related to, but sort of, the country that you're in, to what degree. We have that problem as well, that we tend to dismiss things, especially they say, like, New Yorkers or in general, or Americans, very provincial, right? Anything happening outside is completely not related to us. So, what are the parameters of that, to the degree that, again, both practically it might impact you. People say, no, don't dismiss what's happening over there, because that's going to impact our economy here, and sometimes people acknowledge that, and sometimes they still dismiss it because it's still not America, so who cares? I think there are those two issues. To what degree will it actually have an impact, and to what degree do we perceive a sense of it relating to us? What are the limits of B'chol Makom? Now, again, that does also highlight the difference between the earlier case. The earlier case of the, what do you call it, of the raining only on one city, or the or the dever mapolet only on one city, means that there's really not such a concern that it's going to spread. Right, it is only going to be in that one local region. If it's going to spread, then you would be doing the full package in the surrounding cities. But you're right. The first case, you're only doing the half the package. So there, it is assumed that it's going to remain local. And even though it's going to remain local, nevertheless, the surrounding villages, to some degree, participate in a lesser effect. But when there's a real concern that it's going to spread and directly impact, then you do the whole package, the Taanit with the Tefillah. When it's going to remain local, but I'm surrounding and I'm nearby, then I participate in a more partial way.
So you're saying that the troops then
Yeah.
Which is not going to. If I'm in America.
Well, that's the question. What's the limit of b'chol makom? I presumably it's not. There's some limits to it. Okay, but still, there's still the difference between it spreading and it might impact me. What are the limits of b'chol makom, as opposed to the earlier case where it wasn't spreading, but it's still happening to a place that's nearby? What's my degree of participating and of caring about that when it's nearby, but it's not going to directly impact me?
I find myself in a funny position of arguing for the empathy side of the argument, because in a number of the circumstances, as long as the event doesn't spread,
right?
And if you assume that there's a regional economy, it serves to the benefit of the people living around.
Right. You mean the fact that it raises the prices go up? I sort of said that not sarcastically, but snidely before. Yes, it's true. Right.
It's totally true. So
right.
So I think that thinking about the way people really live,
yeah,
it has to be an empathetic response, as opposed to
right. If it's not going to spread and it's not going to impact me at all, then it's I think I appreciate that. Yeah. Okay. So now it says that is now 3 sections we've got immediately. Things that have impacted local won't spread, but the way in which the surrounding villages have a partial participation, and things that actually might spread, and everybody has to go to the extreme. The question I'm just raising is how far. What's the limits of everybody? What's the limits of kol makom? Now, 4th category, al elu matru'in b'Shabbat. Some things are so bad that you even do it on Shabbat. Now, if matru'in means shofar blasts, which is a question. I mean, you don't blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah. On Shabbat, but okay, maybe this is like a real thing that's happening right now, pikuach nefesh. But again, if it's a way of praying to God, right? So God doesn't exactly need the shofar blast. So let's take a look. But maybe that's why the Gemara was inclined earlier to say that matru'in does not mean shofar. Matru'in means tefillot, because I couldn't imagine that you would blow the shofar on Shabbat. But al elu matru'in, but these are the ones that you do the special tefillot with or without shofar, but you do the special tefillot even on Shabbat. Al ir shekifu nachrim, on a city that is surrounded by non-Jews and it's about to be like it's being besieged. O nahar, or a river that presumably is about to overflow. Val hasvina miturefet biyam, or on a boat that's being tossed around in the sea that's caught up in a storm. And all these things, you would do it even on Shabbat. Now, Rabbi Yossi Omer azara v'lo litza'aka. Yes, you can do it on Shabbat, and this might make more sense if you're dealing also with a shofar blast, but also verbally. But you can do it to call people to aid, right? So you can sound the alarm on Shabbat to call it, because these are things that, people can come, help defend the city, help put the sandbags up for the overflowing river, I'm not exactly sure what the Sfina is. Maybe send out other boats to try to, rescue people. So that you can do, but not with tzaka, not to pray to God. That, that wouldn't allow this to be, do the matru'in on Shabbat, which raises the question. So for Rabbi Yossi, you understand what's unique about these cases. These cases, not only is there a sense of urgency, or emergency, I should say, but there could be an immediate human response. So that's the idea of matru'in afilu b'Shabbat. But according to the Tanakama, if the Tanakama is referring to praying to God, right? So what is the idea of afilu b'Shabbat uniquely here? Maybe also just the degree of emergency is greater than all of these other things. Okay, there's a famine, there's all these things, there's these wolves, but they're not the same sense of every minute counts as are the issue here about a river that's about to overflow, or a city that's about to be, the walls of a city are about to be breached. This is such a degree of emergency that it's afilu b'Shabbat. Yes.
Yeah, but it also depends. You can also make that same distinction over here as to how many other places do it. If it's a river that's going to overflow, it may still go downstream to you, and your city.
All right, so that's another question as well. Fine, we're not combining those, but here we're
Ezra. If I'm already in every yarding,
right,
I can't help them.
Right.
So
okay.
I wouldn't necessarily.
You're right. So the question also has to be asked about the geographic region here, how this intersects with the earlier category. This does not seem to be mehalechet. Okay, so the Gemara says like this: Shimon Atimani Omer Af al Hadever. Even on pestilence, you could cry out on Shabbat, and the sages do not agree, which is interesting because in the context of the emergency, and really understanding, like I said, the CDC and what communicable diseases could be, you understand, you got to nip this in the bud as fast as possible. In the context of the possibility of human intervention, I don't know what they thought you could do about Dever. Okay, I'll work on developing the next vaccine. On any and any affliction that should not come to the tzibur, that's like a way of just being like, like saying, like, can I not, like the opposite of can I not poo poo or whatever, like, not
We're
to
not
speak.
gonna mention
Right,
this.
exactly. It shouldn't happen, but on any affliction, matriina lehen, you do this full package of Taanit with the tefillot, chutz mirov geshamim. The one thing you would not do is too much rain. Too much rain, like you don't, even though it's working out to your detriment, you don't do this extreme sense of ta'anit and tefillot for something that essentially is a bracha. We have enough hard time getting sufficient rain. We're not going to make an overly big deal, even when it's problematic, over too much rain. We might do some small things, but we're not going to do this huge package over too much rain. We should only have such problems. Okay, so now we get the famous story. Ma'aseh story. They told Choni the circle drawer. There's a lot of interesting things to say about this, but I'll save it for when we revisit this in the Gemara. I would just say the following, that this is a story that goes back to the period of the Chashmonayim. Josephus already records a story about Choni HaMe'agel and the Chashmonayim. Not this story, but a story that reflects the fact that one of the brothers, when the two brothers were warring or whatever, asked him to pray that the other side should lose, shouldn't succeed. So there's a clear lead. There was a legend of this Choni HaMe'agel about somebody whose tefillot, were very effective. And people would seek after him in order to impact, the workings of heaven, or to get heaven to respond to what was going down and here down on the earth. Yeah. So here, this is being written about 300 years. Now, and the point also mentioning is, if it's from the time of the Chashmonayim, it's being recorded in the Mishnah like 300 years from the time that he lived. Yes.
The Bilam also had this.
Yeah, exactly. Relevant to this week's parsha, right? Okay, so they said to Choni HaMe'agel, pray that the rains should come. Now, what's interesting also to think about before we continue for this story, which I assume people know, is at what stage did they say this to him? Because just think about the contrast. What has the Mishnah been telling us we're supposed to be doing when there's no rain? Right? Taanit, tefillah, right? At what stage did they go to him? Like, did they try to shortcut the whole thing and say, oh, let's not bother with all of that process, let's just get Choni to pray for us? Or maybe they tried the whole series and it wasn't working, and they're going to Choni as a last resort, right? So it's an interesting to ask, like, when are they going to Choni?
Or you've got two conflicting traditions of theological response. One is you go to an ecstatic,
right,
or to a special individual with
right,
magical powers will work.
Right.
Or you believe that the entire community,
right,
their moral fiber is, God will respond to.
Right. That's an excellent point. Like, who were the people that were going to him? Right. And as we'll obviously see, this type of a power in, as you say, like an ecstatic or a charismatic individual is threatening to the establishment power and institutionalized power. So who are the people going to them? Going to Choni. One presumes that Chazal would not have been happy with going to Choni, right. And we'll see that at the end of the story. So it could be both things are going on. Right. Some people are doing the Taniyot and the whole things as what the Chazal wanted, and other people are saying, let's just go to Choni and get him to work for it. So it's interesting to ask who's going and when are they going to. Okay, but they went to Choni HaMe'agel. Pray that rain should come. Amar lehen, he said, so Choni was very confident about his own abilities, and he said, "Go and bring in the ovens that were used for roasting the psachim. That they should not dissolve, because there's going to be so much rain." Now, number one, it has to rain a lot in order to dissolve pottery, I would imagine. Number two, when is this happening? Right? So if they've already brought their korban pesach, then it's like in the middle of Nisan. We learned before that if it rains in Nisan, it's a siman klala, that the rain isn't doing any good once it's already Nisan. So maybe it's right towards the end of Adar, and that's going to be a parallel version in the Gemara. It's going to be that it was the end of Adar. So they're getting out their Tanurei Psachim, getting ready for Pesach, but it's not yet Pesach. It's mamish at the very, very end, at the last minute. So if that's true, then at least it gives a little context. It's like 6 months or 5 months, right, since the middle of Mar Cheshvan, we've been praying and fasting and garnished. So now, at the very, very end, as a last resort, they're going to Choni. So it's interesting how that might frame it and when this is happening time-wise. Let's just keep going.
Actually, this means they would not have rained for almost a year by that point.
Why a year?
Because there's no rain in the summer there.
Okay, it's a good point. Okay, so now he's saying, go and take in the ovens that they're going to, they shouldn't dissolve. He palel v'lo yardu kashamim. Now he prayed, and maybe there's a little sense of a little serves him right. He's so overly confident. It didn't respond. Okay, ma'asa. What did he do? Ag uga. He made a circle. The amad betocha, and he stood in the middle. The amar, and he said to God, Ribono Shalom, Master of the universe, Panecha samu panehem elai. Your children have put their face towards me. Sha'ani ben bait lefanecha, that I'm like a member of your household. Nishba'ani b'shimcha hagadol. I take an oath in your great name. She'eni zaz mikan ad she'terachim al banecha, that I will not move from this circle until you have compassion on your children. So obviously that sense of of being able to demand, and his arrogance and his own abilities, it carries on even at this stage through the tefillah. Although some do try to say that ben bayit does not necessarily mean like a child, like in your house, like in a parent's house, but it means like a servant, like one of the attendees, one of the people, like the person who brings out who cooks and cleans, or who sweeps up, that's a ben bayit. So they have a little bit of a latitude. So like in Shakespeare, it's the fool that always the clown that always has more of a liberty to speak. So some want to say that that's like what a ben bias is. Somebody who's like a member of the household, not literally part of the family, but somebody who's in the king's castle all the time. Anyway, right. Anyway, that's interesting to wonder what ben bias here, the image of the ben bias. Okay. Nishbani b'shimcha hagadol she'eni zaz. Oh, we did that. Okay. Hitchilu geshamim minatfim. So the rain started to drizzle. Amar lokach shalti. That wasn't what I asked for. Enough rain to fill all of the wells and the cisterns. It started to come down in like anger, like torrential. Amar lokach shalti. That wasn't what I asked for. Rain of desire, bracha v'nedava, blessing and giving. Yardu ketiknan. They fell down in the right way. They had abandoned their houses in Yerushalayim, and they all went up to Har Bayis because of the rains. They came and they said to him, the same way you pray they should come down, pray that they should stop. Amar lehem, he said, go see if the stone of the announcement stone has dissolved. There was a stone in Yerushalayim where basically they would stand up and they would announce people that had lost objects, so everybody, when they would gather for the regalim, would be able to check out, it would be a place of public announcements, and people could find objects that they had lost. So if that stone has dissolved, then I will, then it's gotten to be too much. So one worn down by the rain, right? One wonders what the bigger sort of symbolism of that is. We can try to unpack this a little bit more later. Okay, but again, notice, by the way, there's a certain sense here about him getting his his arrogance sort of continuing. Before he said, but was that the what do you call it? The ovens wouldn't dissolve, and here it's like, I'm only going to stop it once the stone has worn away from the great rain. Like he's not willing to be immediately responsive, and he also but okay, so that's the story. So what happened? Shimon ben Shetach. So Shimon ben Shetach, who was, one of the leaders at that time, said to him, if you were not choni, if you were not somebody that had such powers, goes rani alecha nidui, I would put you in excommunication. Aval ma esel lecha shata mitchatei lifnei hamakom v'oseh lecha ritzoncha. What should I do for you that you are mitchatei before God, and God does your desire? Now mitchatei is not exactly clear what it means, but another place Rashi explains it means basically you misbehave. So you really are like a ben bias. You're like a little kid. Oh, I want this. That's not good enough. Oh, I want something else. That's not what I asked for. I want something else.
Or translates it as nag.
You nag. I think it's misbehave. Okay, you misbehave, but you know what? God is like a father. He has compassion on you. Which does make it sound like Ben Bias is more like literally the child. So know that even when you misbehave, he's willing to go along. That your father will rejoice over you, and presumably even if you don't deserve it. Now, it's a very strange ending, because God was not exactly being osei ritzono there. It does have, right? God was sort of technically responding, but obviously not happy and obviously subverting. So when Shimon ben Shetach is trying to critique him, the fact that he sort of still says that God does your desire, is a little funny. So there's obviously, and one also does imagine, that the Chazal are trying to a little bit cut under his power, his ability as that, because that is threatening to it's not just the problem, presumably. One imagines the problem of Choni was not just that he was a little arrogant to God, so this Cherem is coming to defend God's honor. How could you be so disrespectful to God? But that also he was a little bit threatening to rabbinic authority. And part of this story does undermine that, He thinks he has all these powers, but in the end he misbehaves, and God isn't, sometimes tolerates or indulges, but doesn't always really respond in the way that Choni thinks he's going to get a response.
That some people have special relationships with God.
Yes, that's certainly.
That's a theological issue.
Yes, absolutely. You're right. I mean, that they're not denying that he had that, right? Because so that's interesting. Meaning the fact that there is people that have the power to pray. But notice, by the way, earlier, right? That's a good question. Earlier, when it spoke about the Yechidim praying or the Zakein, those individuals were always anonymous, and what put them in that position was their character and their traits, not some ecstatic ability. So so I do think that the idea of Chazal don't very much, and you understand why establishment authority doesn't want to acknowledge this charismatic power of a particular individual. So I think you're right that here they can't completely deny the reality that everybody saw him as this wonder worker. So but they're undercutting it. So you're right. They could have just said, you don't have this ability. But I don't think that they could say that. There was this perception that he did. But I think that the story in many ways undercuts it. A, he misacts. B, God doesn't really listen. He has this arrogance. It might come to be, it might frustrate it, work against him. So in different ways they're undercutting it, but I don't think they're in a position to completely deny it. But I think what's more interesting is all the stuff we saw before, which is that the Yechidim are anonymous. They're not people charismatic, So I think that's a really being held up in contrast to this. Okay. Hayu mitanim v'yardu lahem geshamim. So they were fasting, and then it started raining. So kodama, do they continue fasting now that they've already started? So kodama neitachama, if it was before sunrise, lo yashlimu, don't finish your fast, because the fast hasn't really, it's Baruch Hashem, it's now raining, and there's no need to finish the fast, and you're not bound by it yet. But if the fast was already after sunrise, so now you've already defined the day as a fast day, yashlimu, you have to finish fasting. So that becomes fascinating, continuing to fast after your prayers are answered because of your obligation of the fasting. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Kodem Chatzot, lo yashlimu lach chatzot, yashlimu, the difference before and after chatzot. Maiseh shegazru Taanit belod the yardu lahem geshamim kodem chatzot, that they had a Taanit and it rained before chatzot. Amalem Rabbi Tarfon tzu v'achlu v'shatu v'asu yom tov, go out, eat, drink, make a yom tov, yatzu v'achlu v'shatu v'asu yom tov, ubo bein harbayim v'karu halel hagadol. And they even came back from Mincha and they read Hallel. Hallel hagadol is not what we call Hallel. What we call Hallel is Hallel hamitzri. Hallel hagadol is what we add to the Psukei de Zimra on Shabbat, the Hodu Hashem, right? Okay. Anyway, so that is very interesting. But again, what this also sort of does bring up is it brings up the almost institutionalized nature of a fast as opposed to the immediacy of the relationship of the previous story. Right? The previous story, Choni was praying, God was answering, there was this immediacy of the relationship. If you think about it, I'm fasting and I'm praying and then God brings down the rain. So what do? I say thank you and I stop fasting and I stop davening. The possibility that you continue to fast even after you've been answered because, technically you've already turned it into a fast day, so you have to finish your fast, again, sort of brings it to the sort of more formal and institutionalized nature of the practice, beyond that just immediate sort of, dynamic with God and the immediacy of the sort of the responsiveness and the relationship. Okay, Mishnah, Gemara. Seder Taniyot Eilom Revia Rishona Raminu. Revia Rishona V'Shniya Lishol Shlishit Litanot. Only if the first and the second dates that are passed when it should have rained, you're still just praying. You only begin fasting when it passes the third date. The whole question earlier, at what stage do you start fasting? So Amar Rav Yehuda Hachikama. So here's what it means when the Mishnah says the first Revia Rishona, you're fasting. Seder Taniyot Amur Eimatai. The normal order of the 3, 3, and 7. When is that? Bizman Yatsa Revia Rishona Vishniya Vishlishit Lo Yardu Geshamim. It means not when the first date has been passed. It means when the first rain has been delayed beyond the first date and the second date and the third date. Now that first rain has been delayed until the third date and still hasn't rained, now we're going to fast. But if the rain came on the first date when it should have come, the zaru and they planted, the lo tzamchu and the things did not sprout, inami tzamchu v'chazru v'nishtanu, or they sprouted, but then they changed in some type of a form. There was some type of a disease in them. Then matrina lehamiyad. Then you do it immediately, even if it's before that date of the third date that had passed. Amar Rav Nachman, dafka nishtanu, only if they have actually undergone some type of a change. Aval yavshu lo, dried out, not. Now, not what is a little unclear. There's two readings of this. One reading is if they dried out, you don't have to fast because that'll recover by itself. The other answer is, the other explanation is don't bother doing the tefillot. The tefillot aren't going to help. If they're already dried, it's done with. But Tosos prefers the first read, which is if they're dried, it's not so bad. They could recover. Much as pshita, obviously, nishtanu tanan, it says if they changed. No, so the case is that not only have they dried, but now they've a little bit like fixed, or it's a little question what that means, but they're a little bit recovered. Now maybe this fact that they're a little recovered, they've dried and they've recovered, but they haven't, again, the way Tosos reads it, they haven't fully progressed, so maybe that really shows that they're like stuck in this mode, like so now maybe actually they need the tefillot because now they're starting to recover. If you don't get the tefillot, then it won't finish and it'll go to waste. Kamash Malan, not that way. Okay, so dried out, again, it's a little hard to read it either way. The other way to read it, maybe, which is easier, is that if it's dried out, you don't bother praying because it's not going to do any good. And then the Havamina makes more sense. No, maybe if it actually seems to start to recover a little bit, we should pray for it. It will do some good. And the answer is no, that's not really significant. And if it really did dry out, then forget about it. They're wasted anyway. Okay. There's a 40-day gap between rains. My makas bitzoret. What's this makas bitzoret? So Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, right, which is in those things that you're matrin alehem miyad, right? So it says Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, baka hamivia lidei bitzoret, a type of a plague or some type of a thing that is going to lead to insufficient rain. So whatever it is, now again, presumably it's rain related, but some type of a thing that's going to lead to insufficient rain. Amar Rav Nachman, Nahara anahara bitzorta. If you can travel by river to get grain from another locale, from like a neighboring village, then it's only considered bitzoret. It's not yet fully at the full stage of tragedy. Medinta amedinta, if you have to go from one country to another country to get grain, kafna. That's a real famine. The kafna is the Aramaic of the word ra'av. Vahi ra'av ba'aretz, right? When Avram goes down to Mitzrayim, the Aramaic is kafna, not betzorta. So there you have to travel to another country. That's already the state of ra'av, of kafna. Let's say a sa'ah of grain costs a selah, which is very expensive. Okay, but nevertheless, even if it's expensive, if there's a lot of grain to be had in the market, so then bitsorta, that's a bitsoret. So it's high inflation, so it's very expensive, but it's very available. So that's only the bitsoret, which is not the full degree of severity. Arba'a v'lo shchicha, if you can get 4 sa'ah for a selah, it's cheap. But you can't find it anywhere. Sure, if you can find it, it's cheap, but nobody has it. Everybody is out of it. So in that case, kafna, it's much worse. It's not about the price, it's about the availability. Again, if somebody, maybe David, who's I see you're leaving, could explain to us, but I don't understand how you could have something that's a rare commodity that everybody needs that remains cheap. Okay, but that's what he's saying. If somehow the prices haven't adjusted yet, and technically it's cheap, but nobody is selling it, then it's considered a rav. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, lo shanu ala bizman shamos bezol peiros biyoker. All of this is true if money is cheap. What means money is cheap? But anyway, people, money is available, and the fruits and the food is expensive. And then we could say, it could be expensive, but if it's available, it's still not considered to be a ra'av.
That actually happens in famines.
that people have money.
Ireland had plenty of food
Sure.
in the 1840s.
What?
Ireland had plenty of food in the 1840s.
They had plenty of
And
food?
1 million people starved to death.
Why?
It was all exported.
Oh, okay. Aval, most biyoker. Wait a minute.
Cheap, maybe it's inflation.
Well, right. Presumably, it means inflation. Aval, most biyoker. If it's very rare to have money, uperos bizol, and the fruit is cheap, so matrina le'em miyad. Then you blow. Then you immediately begin the severe fast. So if everything is selling for $1, but nobody has any money, right? Nobody even has $1. People have a few pennies. So even though it's so cheap, it's only $1. But what really is that not that the prices of the grain have gone up. The prices of the grain might still be low, but nobody has any money. In that case, that's terrible. Damar Rabbi Yochanan, and here now I remember Kadhavu Kaimi Arba Sa'im Besela, where you get 4 sa'a for a sell. It was dirt cheap. But there was a great prevalence of people that were like nefichik fan means people that were bloated because of famine, right? That happens during famine. Why? Nefichik fan b'Tveria means less isar because nobody could even had a penny to spend. Now, I do not understand, and somebody could explain to me, what difference does it make if the reason the stuff is not available is because it's very expensive, or the reason it's not available is because technically the price might be cheap, but nobody has any money. Like, what difference does it make?
In fact, it's the same.
Yeah, I'm not getting something here. I got the first point that it's not about the price, it's about the availability, that makes a huge difference. But I don't exactly get the point here where a high price is not so bad. But a low price that nobody has any money, that's worse. Like, I'm not exactly getting it. All right. Yodu litzmachim avolo li'ilan. Try to get a little bit further. B'yishleim litzmachim v'lo li'ilan. Mishkach like the asa naicha v'lo asa razia. So it's good for the crops and not the tree if it comes down pleasantly and not strongly. Ilan v'lo litzmachim da'asa raz v'lo asa naicha. It's good for the trees and not the crops if it's strong, but it's not like pleasant rain. And good for the trees and the crops, but not for the wells. You have some that's sort of pleasant, that's some that's strong. A lot doesn't come; it doesn't fill up the wells. But we have a brighter that has a fourth category. It's good; it fills up the wells, but not for the trees or the crops. How did that happen? Because it comes in torrents. So a little hard is good for the rains, but torrents, it'll fill up the wells, but it's not good for anything. You make the fasts for the trees in half of Pesach, meaning half a month before Pesach, on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, is when you start worrying about the trees if it's not raining, which is interesting, right? Because, right, we've always been focusing on the crops and in Mar Cheshvan. Here, the trees, although Tu B'Shvat came earlier, but presumably the trees start needing water, by middle, but towards the springtime. So by Nisan, if it hasn't rained, right, again, maybe 2 months or whatever after Tu B'Shvat, by Nisan, if it hasn't rained, you start this for the trees. A new time on the calendar when to start worrying about rain. Now, the wells, even Rosh Chodesh Tishrei, you need it to start raining to fill up the wells, which is funny. Was it the time yet of rain? Is it because people are expecting the Ole Regalim and they're going to need water in their wells? What is it about Rosh Chodesh Tishrei that already you were expecting enough rain to fill up the wells? I really don't get all of this. And for anybody, or all times, if you're running out of drinking water, not just that you don't have enough water to fill up the wells, you don't have drinking water, matrina lein miyad, that you respond immediately. The ezu miyad shalahen, sheni v'chamishi v'sheni. What does the miyad mean? Monday, Thursday, Monday, meaning what's the response? Now, presumably is what that means. It's not like a 7-day period that you respond, it's a 3-day. It's an interesting, way of framing it. And again, as opposed to some of the other cases in the Mishnah, all of these would only be in their region, not in another region. The Askira, which was, what do they think that is? Diphtheria? I thought they said it was croup. What is it, croup? What's that thing about the breathing and the... what's that thing that gets into the throat, right?
That's what it says when the throat is constricted.
Right, isn't that croup? Anybody know about this? No? Sally?
Croup could be viral, right?
I don't know. Okay. Anyway, it was something that was a terribly, painful disease and caused death and sort of invaded through the throat. So for this askara, bisman sheish ba mita, if it led to death, matriin aleha, then you have this response. Bidman she'ein ba mita, if it did not lead to death, ein matriin aleha. So again, one wonders if people understood whether it was contagiable or not. But it's also interesting that if it's just people are getting sick, even a contagious disease, it's not maybe severe enough to have this type of a response. And if it's govai, which are a type of a a locust, then even a small amount, because if you don't just have one locust. If you're going to get a locust, you're going to get a lot. Rabbi Shimon ben Eliezer Omer afal hachagav, which is another type of not grasshopper. Those sound innocent, but whatever it is, another type of a locust. Tano Rabbanan, we'll just do one more. Matrina lilano pishar shnei shavua. You pray for the trees if there's if there's a problem with the rain on all of the other years of the Shemitah cycle, but not on Shemitah itself. Because on Shemitah, people aren't harvesting the stuff. Of course, Dafka, you can make the opposite argument. On Shemitah is when you need there to be fruit on the trees. But for the wells, obviously, even on Shemitah. Even for the trees, because what are the poor going to eat from? They need there to be crops in the ground. That's part of the whole idea of Shemitah. So of course you need it to rain on Shemitah, so that there should be fruit on the trees. Tani idach. One wonders what the Tanakama was thinking. Matrin ala ilanot, maybe because he figured maybe everybody had stored up food for Shemitah. Matrin ala ilanot b'shar shnei hashvua alabot al shichin v'almorot afilu b'shvi'it. But Shem Gamliel omer af al ilanot matrin, even for the trees. Ala svichim matrin af al ilanot. Period. Even on the trees. Matrin ala svichim b'shvi'it mipnei shebish parnasa la'aniyim. So, and it's a little bit. Where were we? It seems like the same thing, except the question about the svichim are also things that grow a little bit like randomly. The way Rashi reads it, afali knows ve'af ala svichim. Svichim are things like the trees, not only fruit that grows from the trees, but also like wild vegetation that grows without being planted. So not just for the trees, but even for other wild vegetation that will grow on Shvi'it that the Aniyim need. There's a whole question about whether you're allowed to eat the Svichim or not. Okay, I think we will have to end here. We'll pick up with this tomorrow. All right. Thank you all for staying a little later. Oh.